Hello and welcome to this presentation about getting started with Isora GRC. For those of you who know me, welcome back. And for those of you who are new to me, my name is Laura, and I'm going to be taking you through some training related to the Isora GRC product. I had some old versions of these videos, and I'm finally getting around to redoing them now that we have a brand new, beautiful graphical user interface, and I'm really excited to be able to take you through this process together. So this training, I do just want to mention that this is geared towards administrators. So that would be people who are in charge of actually maintaining the product as opposed to end users. And we'll talk more about those user types in a few moments. There's just 3 topics I'm going to cover in this presentation. The first one is an overview of Isora GRC. The second topic has to do with which different types of people use it. And then thirdly, we're going to talk about the 3 main types of workflows that you might be using Isora GRC to do. So let's get into that first topic. What is Isora GRC? If you were part of the team that made the decision to purchase Isora GRC, you probably already have a pretty good idea of what it is. But maybe that's not the case. Maybe you came into an existing environment where the product was already in use, or maybe you were just told from somebody else, this is what you're going to be doing. So it is a collaborative governance, risk, and compliance assessment platform. You can use it to assess information security risk across your organization. You can also categorize your inventory based on the type of information stored on it. And you may have various types of information security risk that you're interested in analyzing. Essentially, Isora GRC is going to help you to do that. Usually, though, most people are using the tool because they are trying to achieve compliance with some specific types of regulatory protocols. And there are a whole bunch of supported frameworks that we have listed here, and Isora GRC can help you with all of those. It is a web-based application. Most of our customers access it through their own single sign-on provider. It's hosted in the cloud, but each customer has their own unique URL that they will log into in order to access it. It is basically a standalone application. It is not primarily an inventory management tool, and I do like to mention that up front because it does have a lot of inventory management capabilities. However, it doesn't have any agents that are going to run on other systems in your environment. It doesn't do any automatic discovery of assets. It basically only knows about the inventory that you tell it about. There are 4 main functions of Isora GRC as of today. The first one and the primary function, of course, is assessment. It allows you to quickly and easily create surveys, which you can then use to ask questions about units, applications, or third-party vendor products in your environment. The second aspect of Isora is the inventory aspect. Those 3 different types of objects we talked about, so units, applications, third-party vendors, we can track information related to those objects. And the third function is the risk register. So the risk register is a place for you to track risks that you have discovered. You can rate them based on how severe and how likely you think they are. And you can also keep track of what's being done to mitigate those risks and setting targets for that as well. The fourth and final main function of Isora GRC is exception requests. As you are going about the process of doing assessments, you may discover specific assets, for example, which are out of compliance, but for some reason they need to remain out of compliance. And so you can create and manage exception requests to track that information. So that wraps up the first topic. The second topic is who uses Isora GRC. There are 3 main categories of people who may possibly use this product. And I'm going to start with the second one, which are Isora GRC administrators, because that includes basically everyone watching this video. So if it's your job to maintain the product and maybe you have a role that's pretty important in your information security office, for example, then you may be assigned this role of being a super user on the product. You will have the ability to do a lot of additional things with Isora GRC that ordinary end users would not be able to do. End users, on the other hand, can encompass a variety of different roles. So assessment managers and IT staff, These are two specific roles within the product itself. And those are pretty high-level people that may actually be running assessments as well as answering the questions on assessments. Usually IT staff also may have some sort of inventory management role associated with them as well. Vendor requesters is kind of a weird sounding role, but it's specific to the way that Isora GRC is set up. We have a lot of customers who use the product primarily for evaluating compliance of third-party vendor products. And so you may have people who are in a role, for example, maybe they work in the procurement office and they have a job of ascertaining whether third-party products are acceptable to be used under your information security policy. And so they really wouldn't have the ability to do a lot with other types of assessments, but they would have the ability to create and sort of manage those third-party vendor surveys. And then the last category of end users that's listed there are survey participants. These are essentially just people who may need to log in and answer questions on a survey, or maybe they need to do a data categorization and classification of inventory that they're responsible for or they know about. I didn't mention end users specifically on the chart here, but people who are in charge of specific departments may
have a role as a unit head end user
to come in and acknowledge assessments after they've been completed. The third category of user type is auditors, and this is not as commonly done, but it is possible to have auditors access the Isora GRC tool itself, and they essentially have read-only access to whatever information that you provide for them. So they may be able to see what's going on with current surveys that are in flight, as well as being able to review completed surveys as well. So the third topic is workflows, and we're just going to do kind of a high-level overview of what the general workflow is, and then talk about the three different methodologies with Isora GRC. When you get started with Isora GRC as a new customer, you typically go through a new customer onboarding process that includes an initial assessment or proof of concept. And typically you'll meet with the customer success manager, and you'll do an onboarding kickoff meeting where you'll set goals, you'll prioritize an initial assessment methodology that you want to use, you'll get the ball rolling with respect to customization, and we're going to discuss all these topics in some of the later videos. The next step is usually going to be choosing an existing framework. So Salty Cloud has created a lot of default question sets based on commonly used frameworks, and we can help you get those all set up on your system. Or we do have customers who like to create their own question sets. Maybe they have their own in-house developed framework that they've already been using, and they just need to put it into a format that Isora GRC can work with. The third step on the timeline has to do with scoping and importing data. So for your initial assessment, you're probably going to keep it kind of small, and you're going to decide which types of entities are going to be part of the assessment, and you're also going to figure out which people need to be involved in that assessment. And then you'll have to import or create all of the necessary objects to represent those different entities in the product itself. The fourth step is going to be performing the actual test assessment. Usually, you as an administrator are going to have a very hands-on role in that initial assessment. You'll probably complete the surveys yourself, or you may just tie in a few people that you want to have started with the initial rollout. And then finally, the last step has to do with analyzing the results, looking at the responses that you got, looking at what the reports look like, seeing if you're actually getting the information that you need, or whether you need to go back and maybe make some changes before you start rolling things out to your larger organization. One of the things that you're going to get started with after that initial kickoff meeting is the initial setup and customization. You're going to set goals like we talked about. Maybe it's complying with particular regulations. You're going to choose frameworks or build out custom questionnaires if you have your own internal framework. And then you're going to import data. And some of the types of data that you may need to import are listed there. Units are really fundamental to Isora, and the unit is basically an organizational unit that represents some organizational entity. And it sounds so vague, but it really can mean a lot of different things. In practice, it usually means like departments, but it doesn't necessarily have to. And then you'll also import objects to represent different people who are going to be part of the assessment, as well as creating roles for them, which is what we use to refer to the types of permissions that those people have. And then finally, depending on the type of assessment you're doing, you may also need to create information to represent assets and applications, as well as third-party vendors and products. There's a lot of customization that you can do. So you can add your own custom branding to Isora GRC. There are a number of different pick lists that are mostly related to data categorization and classification. So we can customize those pick lists based on your existing security information policy. And the URL of Isora GRC itself is also customizable. That's something that you normally would set up during the sales process. The overall workflow once you get started, so there's that initial setup customization step, and then you start performing assessments, reviewing results. That may also include adding entries to your risk register. And then as you implement mitigation strategies based on any issues that you may have found, you want to continually keep your unit and inventory data up to date. And then most of these assessments are performed on a regular basis. So after you go through the first couple of rounds, it definitely does get easier because you've sort of laid the groundwork, and then it's very common to repeat the same assessments over time. So now that we've talked about just like the general workflow, I just want to really high level talk about the 3 different assessment methodologies. And then in later videos, we're going to go more in depth on all 3 of these different methodologies. The different methodologies allow you to assess different types of entities. But in reality, you really can assess anything using any of the 3 methodologies. The first type is unit, and the target for a unit assessment is going to be 1 or more internal units. It's optional to also include data classification and categorization of associated assets for each included unit. And we used to refer to the assets as hosts. That was kind of a little bit too restrictive because in reality, the assets really could be anything. In practice, they usually are IP-based assets. The second type of methodology is application. An application assessment consists of just one single survey targeting one single internal application or system, along with a mandatory overall classification and data categorization for the application. So essentially what you're doing, it's another type of internal assessment. It may target an internally developed application, or it may just be your internal implementation of a particular application or system. The difference really between the unit assessment and the application assessment has to do with the complexity. So application assessments are more simple. They just have a single target, and usually it's kind of a smaller scale thing that you're assessing. Whereas a unit assessment, you could have multiple units involved. You're going to basically ask the same set of questions to all of those units. Because of the fact that Isora GRC also supports hierarchy in your units, it also gives the ability to roll up the overall score as well and generate a sort of comprehensive view of your organization based on all of the units if they're all included under one parent unit. So that is also kind of a unique aspect of unit assessments. The third methodology is by far the simplest, and that would be the third-party vendor product assessment. Each assessment of this type consists of just one single survey targeting a single product or offering from a single external vendor. Unlike unit and application surveys, third-party vendor product surveys do have an external link that you can share. So it allows a person who doesn't have a login for Isora GRC to be able to fill out that survey. We do have a lot of customers who are really only interested in one methodology. So part of what you need to do in your goal setting and probably get started on it even in your initial kickoff is going to be figuring out which methodology you're most interested in. It's totally possible to use all of them for different things. But what I have found in the past is that a lot of customers can be very focused on just one specific methodology, at least as they get started. One of the things that people sometimes struggle with is which methodology to use. They may be assessing something that doesn't necessarily fit super neatly into any of the 3 categories. So for example, you may have noticed that there's not a project assessment methodology. However, you could use any of the 3 methodologies to assess a project. It just kind of depends on what you're trying to accomplish and which methodology is going to be the simplest for you to use. So on this page, I've just kind of tried to summarize the differences between the 3 methodologies. UNIT is really the most complex. It's the only methodology that allows you to assess multiple targets simultaneously, asking each target in the assessment the same set of questions. It also has this ability to add data enrichment. And what that will allow you to do is, for every unit that's included in the assessment, any assets which are associated to that unit will automatically get pulled into the assessment. For each of those assets, you will have to decide what is the category of data on this asset. For example, is it confidential? Is it published? Is it sensitive? And if so, why? Does it have PPI on it? Does it have FERPA or HIPAA data on it? Those specific labels that you use could differ depending on how you customize your pick list values. But essentially, if you do include that optional data enrichment, then for every asset that gets pulled into that assessment, you'll have to make a determination on that. They are also the only type of methodology which supports comprehensive reporting, and that is only going to work if you have a hierarchical unit setup that's included in the assessment. Unit assessments also have a multi-step acknowledgement process. There's going to be a pre-final acknowledgement that's done by an assessment manager for each survey, and then a final acknowledgement by the unit head, and that's for each and every survey in the assessment. So again, there's more steps to unit assessments, and there is more setup that you'll need to do in advance. And overall, it's definitely the most complicated type to use. The third one, which I'm not going to jump over to, third-party vendor product, on the other hand, is the simplest methodology. It's much faster to get started with. Each assessment just has a single survey with a single target. There's no data enrichment. You can access the survey internally through your Isora GRC login or externally through the external URL. The acknowledgement is basically uncontrolled. So whoever is filling out that third-party vendor product survey, if they're using the external link, they'll have the opportunity at the end of the survey to do an attestation, essentially. But it doesn't have the same type of locked down acknowledgement process like the other types have. And then finally, another interesting aspect of third-party vendor product assessments is that the completed surveys can also be shared. So across your entire organization, if you set up that third-party vendor product survey to be shared, it will allow other people from other units to access that information. There's also some sharing that you can do with respect to third-party vendor products and vendor objects themselves with respect to inventory. So you can actually import those vendor products as well as pre-filled surveys from other organizations. That's not as commonly done, but it is possible to do, and that's only applicable for those third-party vendor product methodology types. The second one that's in the middle, the application assessment, it's kind of almost like a hybrid between the two. So it has some aspects of unit methodology and some aspects of the vendor methodology. Similar to the third-party vendor product assessment, it does have just one single target, so that makes it a lot simpler. One of the most interesting aspects of it is that the data enrichment portion is mandatory. So you will have to specify a data classification and optional categorization for it. And then it has a simpler acknowledgement process. In the case of application assessments, it's possible for assessment managers to create them complete them, and do a final acknowledgement on them all at once. And it just has that one-step final acknowledgement, so it is a little bit simpler. I do want to just mention that some aspects of particularly the permissions are likely to change in the future. So for example, the acknowledgement process for unit and application assessments, as of right now, it's pretty much fixed, but it is possible in the future that it will be customizable. And also the capabilities that different roles have, that is potentially going to change. We're hoping in the future to have a more flexible and more customizable permission system in Isora GRC. But I just need to kind of focus on how it currently works right now. So I just do like to remind you that you can use any of the 3 methodologies to assess anything. There's nothing really wrong with doing that. It's just whether you're going to get confused by it. But it is possible because they have these different characteristics. You may have some object you're trying to assess. Maybe it doesn't really neatly fit into any of the categories. Or maybe there's something that some feature that you really need that only one of the methodologies has. And so no matter what it is you're assessing, you may just need to use that particular methodology. Each time you get started, there's going to be a planning phase, and some of this is just kind of recap of what we talked about. But with the goal setting, you really need to know what you're trying to comply with, what you're trying to assess. Most people, by the time they get to the point of purchasing a Isora GRC, they know what they're trying to accomplish, but not everybody does. Maybe your information security policy is just really brand new or kind of non-existent, and you're just getting started with this. So if that's the case, you kind of need to start from there. Figure out what you're trying to comply with, and then figure out which methodology you want to initially use. And then from there, it's just a matter of scoping, figuring out which objects you need to set up, who needs to be involved, and then making policy decisions. So hopefully you have an existing security information policy that you can just sort of follow along with. But if not, maybe you need to develop some new policies as well. And then after that planning phase, there's an implementation step for each of the planning steps. So on the goal setting side, you figured out what you're trying to comply with. So now choose a framework based on that. And Salty Cloud can help you out a lot by importing the pre-built question sets to support those existing frameworks. On the scoping side, you figured out who or what needs to be involved. So you need to set up your units, create user accounts for those users who need to be involved, assign roles, and then you may need to import inventory as well. And then finally, on the policy decision side, based on your existing policy, you can apply customizations for your pick list labels. You may need to customize your question sets, or customize like how the questions are scored, for example. So again, it kind of ties into your existing or new policies. So that pretty much summarizes those 3 topics that we wanted to talk about. I just want to now help you out with a few hints about where you can get more help. There's a lot of contextual help built into the product. As you are going through the different screens, just look for those little question mark icons, because if you click on them, they'll pop up a tooltip for you. And most of those tooltips also have links into the online documentation where you can find specific information related to what you were looking at. The online documentation can also be accessed by just going to help.isora.saltycloud.com. And I'm definitely interested in any feedback that you guys have. The new online documentation platform has like a little smiley face or sad face at the end of each article. So I definitely invite you to use those to give me feedback on whether those documents were helpful to you or not. And then there's also that main question mark link on Isora GRC. By default, it takes you to the online documentation. But what I always encourage customers to do is, as you are completing that initial assessment and you're getting ready to roll out Isora GRC to your larger organization, it's super, super important that you create your own custom site-specific user documentation. And I would even maybe even create multiple versions of it for the different types of people who are part of the assessment process. Now, you may not need to do this if you're a really small shop, like you are like a one-person compliance department, for example. You're creating the surveys, you're answering the questions, and you're looking at the reports. You're doing it all. That's fine. You probably don't need to worry about this. But we have a lot of universities, for example, where they're rolling out unit assessments that are crossing tens or hundreds of units. And you may have at least one person per unit that's going to be involved in answering those questions. And so it's really important for them to have information that's specific to your process, because Isora GRC is a flexible tool. Different institutions are using it in slightly different ways. And so if they click on the help button in Isora GRC, they're going to get help with the tool itself. But that may not answer the question that they have that's specific to your use case. So that's why I always just really encourage people, develop something that's specific, publish it on a wiki, and then maybe even send us an email to support at Salty Cloud and have us customize the help link. That main help link on Isora can be redirected to go to your own specific help page. Okay, I've done enough preaching. I'm going to insert some V cards here once I get those other videos done and take you to some next places that you're going to want to look so you can get more specific details about doing assessments with all three of those different methodologies, as well as some information related to initial setup and customization, all that good stuff. So thank you so much for being with me, and I'll see you again next time.